Our speaker for today is Dr. Christine Luscombe. Christine Luscombe is currently a professor and a chair of the faculty at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Okinawa, Japan. After receiving her BS degree in Natural Sciences from the University of Cambridge in 2000, she worked in the Melville Laboratory of Polymer Synthesis at the University of Cambridge, where her research focused on surface modifications using supercritical carbon dioxide for her PhD degree. In September 2006, she joined the Material Science and Engineering Department at the University of Washington, Seattle. Her current research focuses on the synthesis of semiconducting polymers for organic electronics, with a particular focus on developing new methods to synthesize polymers and developing polymers for stretchable electronics and mixed ionic and electronic conduction. She has published more than 140 papers in this area of research. Her academic and research endeavors has led her to multiple awards and recognitions. She received a number of young faculty awards, including the National Science Foundation Career Award, TARPA Young Faculty Award, as well as the Sloan Research Fellowship. More recent awards include Society of Synthetic Organic Chemistry of Japan Lecture Award in 2017, elected member of Washington State Academy of Sciences 2020, and Society of Polymer Science Japan Science Award in 2022. In her academic leadership role, she served as the interim chair for the University of Washington Material Science and Engineering Department during 2020 and 2021. And in 2022, she was named as chair of the faculty at OIST. She is serving on the board for the Society of Polymer Science Japan, where she is responsible for increasing the international outreach for the society. She is also the president of the Polymer Division for IUPAC, which boasts more than 100 volunteers. Thank you, Professor Luscombe, for joining us. The stage is all yours.
To do with the fact that we can make more lightweight electronic devices, potentially make deformable devices, and hopefully be able to make the devices in a much more cost-effective manner. And in the case of when we're developing materials for things like displays, the cost-effectiveness is not as important, but when we're considering making things like photovoltaics, this cost-effectiveness is hugely important. And the things that enable these applications is, first of all, the reason that the devices can be cost-effective is because we can do solution processing to create the devices. So, for example, we can use technologies such as inkjet printing or spin coating in order to make the devices, and that's what makes the devices cheaper. But there's other attractive features about organics, and that's the fact that you can make them have properties that you need. They're very versatile, and you can make them have properties that you need them to have. So, for example, you can make the materials be more biocompatible by adding functional groups. And then depending on the application that you're targeting, you can really tweak the properties. So, for example, if you're targeting OLEDs, then you would want to design materials that are much more highly emissive. But on the other hand, if you're designing materials for photovoltaics, you would want to have materials that are much more light absorbing. So it's really the fact that you can really functionalize the organic semiconductors and tweak their properties that make them really hugely attractive. And so in terms of what we do within our group, we do kind of everything in the fact that we start off with doing chemical synthesis. Once we synthesize the polymers, then we look at the properties of the individual polymer chains. Once we've looked at the individual polymer chains, then we really study the thin film structure of the materials. And once we've elucidated the thin film structure, then we do take our materials onto applications. And so in terms of that, we do study the material's properties as well. And as was mentioned in the introduction, we have done some work on photovoltaics, but more and more the types of applications that we are looking at is to use the materials in stretchable electronics, but also develop mixed ionic electronic conductors with applications in bioelectronics in mind. So these days, the properties that we look at are related to stretchable electronics and also bioelectronics applications. But today, what I'll really be doing is focusing on more of the synthesis aspect of the work that we do. So I won't be talking about any of the applications at all. I'll really be focusing on the synthesis. And on the synthesis side, we've had one major goal in our group. And the one major goal that we have is to try and answer this question of, can we design and synthesize semiconducting polymers with the level of precision that nature can? So when we think about nature's macromolecules, such as protein or DNA, we know that they can be synthesized with control over the molecular weights. There is no molecular weight distribution in that you just have a single molecular weight species. And then finally, you get sequence specificity in nature. So what we want to try and do is to achieve that precision within semiconducting polymers. But the other thing that we want to do is, so mimicking nature exactly is not always very efficient. So the other thing that we want to be able to do is to synthesize these polymers with precision, but do so efficiently and in a more environmentally benign manner. So from a synthetic point of view, these are some grand challenges that we have had in our research group. So how do we try to do this? So I just want to take a step back and introduce to you some common semiconducting polymers. So this one here, P3HD or poly3-hexylthiophene, this is one of the more original polymers alongside the one next to it, which is known as polyparaphenylvinylene or PPV. And you can see that over the years, the polymers have become progressively more and more complicated. And with this complex structures, the performance of the polymers has really drastically improved over the past few years. But despite these complexities, all of them have one thing in common, which is that they are all conjugated polymers. And by that, I mean that they all have a single bond, double bond, single bond, double bond alternating structure. Regardless of the complexity, they all have that in common within the polymer backbone. I just mentioned that these complex structures have really resulted in seeing huge advancements in the properties that we see. And so just as an example, I'm showing you a relatively recent paper which shows an extremely highly efficient photovoltaic device. And this is an all-organic device. And you can see that a 19% efficient device has been achieved, which is a really extremely highly performing device. But you'll note that the materials that are used, again, they're really quite complicated structures. And this complexity results in a difficult synthesis. So just as an example, on the following slide, I have the synthesis of a polymer known as D18. So I have to admit, one of the problems in our field is that the polymer names are not the greatest, but this is a polymer that has been called D18. And it is a polymer that has resulted in very high performances. But you'll see that the synthesis is very, very long. It goes on and on and on. And if you count up the steps, it corresponds to 15 steps. And one of the issues that we face is that from lab to lab, when you try to reproduce the synthesis, actually, we often find that we're not able to reproduce the results. And so clearly, it's great that the performance of the materials has improved, but there is a great need to be developing more efficient and more reliable reactions that help to reduce the number of steps involved in the synthesis. And so looking at this synthetic scheme, there's so many steps, and there are so many steps that we could tackle. But there is one thing that we have particularly focused on, and it's at the final stages. And the ones that I've highlighted here, these steps correspond to the joining of aromatic rings together. So in other words, it corresponds to the steps, which are metal catalyzed cross-coupling steps. And the reason that we focus on is it's because it's this step that enables the polymerization. So on that note, I just want to quickly introduce to you how we typically make semiconducting polymers. So if you could imagine that these are aromatic rings that we're trying to connect together, the standard way that we make the polymers is we have one monomer, which would have two halogens attached to them. And then we have another monomer that has the organometallic species attached to it. And then we'll add in a catalyst, typically nickel or a palladium-based catalyst. This initiates the cross-coupling reaction, and you get this alternating structure forming. And many of you are probably familiar with this catalytic cycle of the repetitive cycle of oxidative addition, transmetallation, and reductive elimination, and so on. The name of the polymerization changes depending on what the organometallic species is. But if it's an organotin, then this would be called a Stille reaction. If it's a boronic ester, then a Suzuki-Miura reaction, and so on and so forth. But this is generally the way that the polymers are synthesized. But the unfortunate thing about this is while these do give the polymers that you need, because they are basically based on a step growth polymerization, this polymerization results in broad molecular weight distributions. So you have a sample with different molecular weights present. And another issue that we face is that in step growth polymerizations, it's very difficult to control the average molecular weight of your sample. So in order to overcome this, we developed a reaction which we call the X. In this case, what we introduce is we introduce an initiator, which also contains the catalyst. To this, we can add the monomer, and this converts the step growth polymerization into a chain polymerization. And actually, it's more like a living polymerization. And this allows us to really synthesize polymers such as P3HT in an extremely controlled way. So the benefits of doing this polymerization is that we end up with very well-defined molecular weights. If we target a specific molecular weight, we can obtain it. And this is what this graph is showing. The solid line is the calculated molecular weight that we were theoretically expecting. And you can see the squares are the experimental data points that we obtained. There's other advantages in the polymerization that we developed, which is that we end up with very narrow molecular weight distributions or dispersities. So an ideal system would have a dispersity of 1. In this polymerization, we get about 1.1, 1.2, which is not bad. Other factors is that by incorporating this initiator, we start to be able to control the end group that we have in the polymer. And what the MOLDI spectrum down here shows is that using this system, we have one set of end groups. So it shows that our initiation efficiency is 100%. Another aspect that I haven't touched upon yet is what's known as the regio regularity. So you could imagine that if some homocoupling had taken place, we would end up with head-to-head or tail-to-tail coupling occurring. But by using this method, we're actually able to obtain 100% regio-regular polymer, which leads to greater performing materials. So just looking at some brief property aspects of the polymers that we're able to synthesize. So I mentioned that, well, we can make 100% Riescher regular polymer. And quite often we get asked, well, isn't 98% good enough or 96% good enough? And what we were able to show in an older study here is that actually it does matter in that by synthesizing a material with greater Riescher regularity, even if the Riescher regularity difference is low, we do obtain a more crystalline system. Looking at other aspects of this as well. So one of the things that I highlighted is, well, we can introduce different types of N groups. And the question is, well, do these N groups really matter? And in this study that I'm showing on the right, we showed that the N group does really matter. So if you could imagine the crystalline domain of your polymer, you'll have a polymer chain folding back and forth and back and forth. N groups do end up in the crystalline region, and the N groups act as defect in the crystal. But if the N groups are more similar to the backbone, so for example, if the N group is an aromatic group, then it disrupts this crystal less, and so we end up with greater performance by controlling the N group. Other things that we often get asked is, well, what about the dispersity? Does it really matter if it's a dispersity of 2 versus something lower? And again, in the same study that I just showed, we showed that the dispersity does matter. So a combination of the molecular weight and the dispersity does help to improve the performance. So again, looking at the same picture here, polymers have kind of a natural folding length where they fold. And if the length of the polymer fits the width of the crystal, or if it's exactly double the width of the crystal, or in some cases even triple the width of the crystal, then if we have that molecular weight, and if all the chains have the same molecular weight, we can entirely avoid the N groups being in the middle. And that way we were able to show that we can improve the crystallinity of our materials and therefore improve the charge transport. Other things that we have been able to do based on these very well-defined materials is that we've been able to collaborate with a lot of research groups globally in order to help us understand fundamental aspects about semiconducting polymers. So I'm just showing you one particular example here, which was a collaboration with Professor Lin Lu, who is at Princeton University. So just looking at this picture of a semiconducting polymer film, it's a semi-crystalline system with crystalline domains and also amorphous domains here. And we generally know that the macroscopic film, and the question was, well, how do the charges move from crystal to crystal to reach the other end of the film? And what we were able to show in this particular paper was that you do actually need tight chains connecting these crystals. And by having access to well-defined molecular weight systems, we were able to alter the tight chain fraction, and were able to determine what tight chain fraction was really needed in order to get good charge mobility coming through the material. So this is just one example of a collaboration that we were able to do by having access to well-defined systems. What our externally initiated system has also allowed us to do is we were able to synthesize polymers that at the time were not accessible. Well, I should have said architectures that were not accessible before. So previously, people hadn't been able to do surface-initiated polymerization. So by having this initiating scheme, we were able to do that. We were also able to make star polymers. So we decorated a core with 3 nickel complexes, and we were able to initiate a SAR polymer synthesis that way. And we did other things like graph copolymer synthesis. So we were able to access these architectures that at the time were not as explored because of the lack of synthetic methods. So that kind of covers like the controlled polymer synthesis aspect. And so in other words, it kind of addresses the reliability aspect in polymer synthesis. But we also wanted to, as I mentioned before, address this issue of efficiency. So in order to address this efficiency aspect, there is this polymerization method that has attracted a lot of interest in recent years. And so people like Mario Leclerc have written a number of review papers about this as well. But basically, the big difference here is, so this is what I've presented already, the more general scheme to synthesize semiconducting polymers. You have two monomers, both of which are functionalized. But in the case of direct arylation polymerization, or DARP, well, the idea is that one of the monomers would be completely unfunctionalized. So you just have a CH bond. And the idea here is that you would still be able to react these two monomers and be able to obtain the polymer. And so this is a great way to synthesize polymers because, first of all, going from this monomer to here is usually a two-step synthesis. So if you don't have to make this at all, you save the number of steps involved in the overall synthesis. But also, doing this synthesis, you have to use a stoichiometric amount of these organometallic reagents. So you also save on a lot of the reagent as well. So overall, DARP is a hugely attractive way to synthesize polymers. However, it's not without issue, because if you think about it, organic molecules contain a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds. So how do you make sure that you only react one particular carbon-hydrogen bond and be able to make a polymer with regiospecificity? So for us, we were interested in DARP, but we were still interested in being able to do that controlled polymerization. So we wanted to do DARP, but still be able to control the molecular weight. So in other words, we wanted to do that standard P3HT synthesis, but use DARP. So here I'm showing again the general way that we make P3HT. You start off with a bis-halogenated monomer. One side is activated with a Grignard, you add a catalyst and you get the polymer. But if we were to do DARP, it would be the following. We would start with a monohalogenated monomer, add a catalyst, and get the polymer. But then there's two challenges. Well, how do we make sure? Well, there were challenges involved in that we could not identify a single catalyst that would get us all the way over here. And one of the things that we decided was, well, maybe if we actually had two catalysts, we might be able to do this. So in other words, if we had one catalyst that would do the CH activation, but then we hand over to another catalyst to do the controlled polymerization, we might be able to get it to work. But the key thing is this first step needs to be catalytic too. So in order to redraw this, what we really need is the following. We have one catalytic cycle that's doing the CH activation, but then at this stage, it needs to hand over to the catalyst that does the polymerization, and you get the controlled polymerization going. And so in order to get this to work, there's multiple challenges, one of which is, well, can we get the transmetallation from one metal to the other work at the right point? But also we needed to identify two catalysts that would not interfere with each other. And we were able to identify such a system. As a starting point, we used gold. And then for the catalyst to do the polymerization, and so first of all, well, does the polymerization work at all? Here I'm showing some molecular weights. So yeah, we do get the polymerization to occur. There are other questions too, though. was it controlled? Like, were we getting controlled molecular weights? And you can see from the theoretical molecular weights by GPC and NMR, we're getting relatively good agreement. So it is controlled. We can target a molecular weight and get that molecular weight. Other things, part of the control means being able to change the monomer catalyst ratio and get that molecular weight. And so usually if you increase the monomer to catalyst ratio, you get an increase in molecular weight. And so you can see going slow means increasing monomer catalyst ratio, and you see that increase in molecular weight. So we're getting that control aspect too. And then finally, in polymer chemistry, the big goal is always to achieve what's known as a living polymerization. And what a living polymerization never terminates. And one of the tests that we can do to kind of show living characteristics is the following. You do a polymerization, and once all your monomer is consumed, you add a second batch of the monomer. If it's not a living polymer, you wouldn't get any chain extension occurring at this stage. But in our case, we do, which is highly suggestive of a fact called DARP. And we subsequently, after the gold work, we've optimized the system significantly. And what works best is now a combination of a silver catalyst and a palladium catalyst. And by doing so, we get a good polymerization. Having said that, this work is not without its issues. So one of the problems that we have is that the molecular weight that we can synthesize is limited. And this is really because this first cycle here is slow. Just fundamentally breaking a CH bond is a difficult thing. And so we have a limitation there. And another thing is I mentioned the importance of having two metals which are orthogonal to each other. And unfortunately, silver and palladium are not completely orthogonal. And that is an issue that we have. So moving forward, what we really need to do is to carefully alter the ligands so that we can create a truly orthogonal system. So I just have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to really very, very briefly introduce one of our more recent things that we're focusing on related to the synthesis of semiconducting polymers. So at this stage, I've introduced DARP. So in this case, you just have one unfunctionalized monomer. The other is still functionalized. You add a catalyst and you get the polymerization to occur. What would be even better and more elegant from a synthesis point of view is to do the following. Can we have two completely unfunctionalized monomers and still be able to make a polymer with complete control over the region specificity? And this type of reaction is known as a CDC reaction or a cross-dehydrogenative coupling reaction. But in this case, the challenges are even greater. So the same challenges as before still exist. All molecules have a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds. So how do you ensure that only one reacts? But also, in this particular case, how do you prevent the blue aromatic ring from reacting with itself? Same here. How do we make sure that the red one doesn't react with itself and ensure that you only get a cross-coupling reaction occurring? So even greater headaches than before. So I'm not really not going to talk about this in work in detail, and I'm not doing Li Wen's work. So Li Wen is the first author of this paper any justice. She spent 5 years of her PhD really trying to understand these reactions. But what we have been able to do is, inspired by work performed by the Kambara group, also based in Japan, is this reaction right here, this is a CDC polymerization. If you do this reaction, you get really great molecular weights with minimal homocoupling, the reaction that we're trying to, what we were really able to identify is the mechanism of this polymerization that allows this reaction to go as well as it does. So now that we have this mechanistic understanding, we're trying to move towards making other types of polymers using this CDC polymerization. So I've skipped a lot of detail here, but I urge you to look at our papers about this. So because of time, I'll be ending here. But just to conclude, in terms of achieving more reliable and more controlled semiconducting polymer syntheses, we're getting there, but we still do admittedly have a very, very long way to go. But the good news is we are getting there in that in this last work with the CDC polymerization, we are actually getting closer to be able to achieve a sequence-specific polymerization. The questions we still have are related to, for example, monomer scope, like can we expand the types of monomers that we can use in these polymerizations? And there's still questions that need to be answered about the degree of control that we can obtain. But I'll just add that one of the things that we have found is that semiconducting polymer synthesis never ever works the way we expect it to work. It's always full of surprises, and it creates a lot of headaches, but it's a lot of fun for us all at the same time. So I hope that I was able to give you a glimpse of the types of things that we think about in terms of semiconducting polymer synthesis. So last but not least, again, I really want to thank all the people, past and present, who have contributed to what I presented today. As I said, I have not done any of the lab work associated with this work, so I'm very, very grateful for all their contributions. So thank you.